Hello and welcome to episode 214 of the Chills of Will podcast. It's a pleasure today to be joined by Leah Myers. Leah Myers is a member of the Jamestown S'Klallam Tribe of the Pacific Northwest. She earned her MFA in creative nonfiction from the University of New Orleans, where she won the Samuel Mockbee Award for nonfiction 2 years in a row. She now lives in Alabama with roots in Georgia, Arizona, and Washington. Her work has previously appeared in the Atlantic, Craft Literary Magazine, Fugue Journal, and everywhere would be nice, but elsewhere. Her debut memoir, Thinning Blood, is published by W. Norton and received a rave review in the New York Times. Leah, good afternoon. How's it going?
Hi, it's going well. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. Great to talk to you. I'd love to know about growing up. It's pretty cool. You talk about having roots in these different states and these different places. Obviously, Washington State is a huge part of the book of your memoir. But I'd love to know about growing up and specifically your relationship with the written word. Were you a big reader, always at the library? What kind of stuff were you reading? What was that all? How was that as a kid and in your relationship with the written word?
Oh yeah, I've always been a big reader. My dad taught me to read before I was in school,
Hmm.
at least a little, and so I've always been around books, and I found that was my first like escape into things, is realizing that books were a way to travel anywhere,
Hmm.
stories and the written word. And so I've always been surrounded by books. I have a hard time parting with any.
Right.
Um, and so it's been, yeah, ever since I was young, always been very interested in reading pretty much anything. I
Hmm.
liked mysteries. I liked documentary or like nonfiction things, fantasy.
Hmm.
I know I've like read a lot of like more like literary like or the like pop culture novels like
Hmm.
Stephen King,
Hmm.
but all the way from that down to like literary magazines and things like that.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, you're talking about having trouble parting with books, and you said books were your first, like you say, love. Sounds like a love affair, right? I mean, it really is
Yeah,
like a love for reading that we all have. It's pretty cool
absolutely.
the way you describe that. That's awesome. Being surrounded by love. I mean, books. I love
It's the
it.
same thing.
Same thing. Same thing. Exactly. In um in the book in Thinning Blood, you talk about reading like Sherman Alexie. Gosh darn him and his terrible behavior outside of his. We'll just talk about his books. Joy Harjo, the great writer and I believe poet laureate, right?
Yes, she's poet laureate.
Yeah, and Natalie Diaz. My when was it when my brother was an Aztec? I think I'm mixing up the title a little bit.
No, yeah, When My Brother Was an Aztec
When my
was
brother was an
her
Aztec,
first release, and then she's also got more recently Post-Colonial Love Poem.
right? And I want to say maybe National Book Award, one of the huge awards, Pulitzer Prize,
I think so, yeah.
right? So I just wonder about like about representation, being part of the S'Klallam tribe, being native, and then some of what you read when you were growing up or what you didn't read, and whether you were kind of consciously looking for other native writers, or if it's something that was more subconscious or something you realized later on. Sorry, that's a million questions at once, but
That's okay. Um, I think that started, I didn't start out looking for native writers. It didn't even occur to me that that was something I could look for a long
mm-hmm.
time, just because it was not a very, there wasn't much representation at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then when I read, I talk about it in the book, but when I read Sherman Alexie's The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven, um, which is an amazing collection of
Oh, so
stories,
good, so good.
and I read that, and it was amazing how even if it wasn't representation one to one of like my experience
Mm-hmm.
and everything, it was still it was wonderful to see like my culture in a way sort of
Yeah,
reflected.
yeah,
Um, and that really sparked that opened up the door to realize like, oh, I could try and seek this out,
sure.
which led to like you said, Joy Harjo, Natalie Diaz,
Mm-hmm.
many others.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I wonder, getting into college and beyond, even up to today, who you reading, who challenges you as a writer, who you're just really interested in reading, whether or not it's reading for pleasure, reading for like looking for craft, but who are some of the writers who really thrill you, challenge you these days and more recently?
my a sort of touchstone for me is always Natalie Diaz.
Mhm.
I can always go back to her work and her interviews and everything, and really find new inspiration and new challenges to sort of face on my own. Which is funny because she's a poet, um, but I still find a lot of connection there.
Mhm.
Um, Tommy Orange, I've read some of his work in anthologies and individually, always wonderful.
Mhm.
Um, and lately I have been looking more into less like instead of specific authors, um, anthologies of upcoming writers or groups of writers. I just finished both Never Whistle at Night, which is edited
All
by
right.
Sean Hawke, which is
Yeah.
amazing, and Out There Screaming, which is edited by Jordan Peele.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So Never Whistle at Night is indigenous dark fiction and horror, and Out There Screaming is black dark fiction and horror, black authors. And so it's really good.
That's awesome. Does Jordan Peele have his own work in there?
I think he did the foreword, but he doesn't have
Okay.
his own work.
Yeah.
He curated the work from
Yeah.
others.
Yeah. Awesome. And
He's very good.
Did Morgan Talty get in? He's in Never Whistle at Night, I think.
I think
You know?
so.
Okay. Yeah.
It's
Oh,
hard to but it was about like a month or so ago that I finished that one, but it
yeah.
was very good.
Oh, that's awesome. You brought up something that I was going to follow up on. Ah, darn, I forgot. But as far as like the writing bug, then, so what made you? I mean, it sounds like you've been writing for as long as you can remember. But what were kind of maybe some of the pivotal points? Maybe any eureka moments where it's like, oh, I can do this and I can do this well.
I think I have been writing forever. It's fun to find old stories from before, when I could just start to write. I was writing stories. It's just in my blood. Um, but I some of the pivotal moments were um like projects where I had to present the things that I'd written.
Yeah.
I remember going up in front of people, and there was this I'm not very good at speaking, or I was not, especially as a child, very good at public speaking.
Hmm.
And I remember a couple of times in class going up to read something and being terrified, and then seeing that I had an impact, like the work that I wrote
Mm,
made an impact on the people around me. And it was, it wasn't like a crazy impact, but it was enough that I noticed.
sure.
And so that's probably the earliest ones were those sort of like projects, the poetry or short story things in a middle school and high school. And
Yeah.
then uh, as I went on, realizing just I was always happiest when I was writing. That
Hmm.
always felt the most correct.
Yes. No doubt about it. I appreciate it. Yeah, the idea of you seeing the impact that you make on others makes an impact on you. I love that cycle.
Yeah,
When you're sharing your own work. Yeah, it's pretty nerve-wracking though, right?
it is. It can be terrifying.
Thank you. You took me back to some bad experiences from college workshop. No, I'm just kidding. Nah. And some good ones. And some good ones.
Yeah.
But I did want to pick up on what you said earlier, just talking about Tommy Orange. Like, I'm sorry to keep coming back to the love thing, but it's like that first love was there. I haven't read. I feel like I don't want to like mess it up by reading anything else of his. I'm sure it's great. His, there is just is so good. Anything
Yeah.
else you'd recommend by him? I don't think he has any collections since then. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's
Um,
more just like single stories. But anything else that you recommend by him?
I believe he had something in Never Whistle at Night. I
Okay.
think he did have something there. Most of what I know is like individual short stories.
Okay.
But I think he had a novel coming out soon.
Yeah, sounds
Um,
right.
but as far as previous collections, I think mostly I've seen him in anthologies or as
Hmm.
one-offs in like literary magazines. Um, but I do remember seeing like his short story. It was in Never Whistle at Night. I don't remember what the title of his was, but it was
Okay.
amazing.
Awesome. I think me and you will be first in line for the novel, right? Oh
Absolutely.
man. You wrote in the book about a really pivotal meeting with your professor in MFA program. I want to say at Arizona State. Yeah.
MFA was in New Orleans,
Oh,
University of New
pardon me.
Orleans.
It's part of the biography. Sorry. And and the idea of it being so pivotal about the professors telling you kind of like, hey, you're maybe not putting out your best effort, and that way you can kind of protect yourself. You're trying that way you won't sabotage yourself, that type of thing. I just wonder about that switch being turned kind of thing, the switch being turned on, where you're really able to become the full-fledged writer that you are now.
Yeah, that was definitely a really big turning around moment, I think, because there was this sense of protection in a lot of parts of my life where it was
Mm,
I purposefully set myself up to fail.
sure.
Because if there was a reason besides the fact if I, as she put it, if I was terrified to write and give it my all and it still not be good enough,
Mm-hmm.
because then that meant that I was bad.
Right.
Whether or not that was true, that was how my brain was interpreting it.
Sure.
And I really needed somebody to lay it out for me and say, like, hey, you're doing this and you need to stop it.
Mm.
Um, and she did. She did not mince her words. She was very direct in how that went. And it was hard to hear. It's
Yeah.
never easy to hear that somebody can see that what you're doing, and even if you can't see it.
Yeah.
Um, but it was very important and set me up to succeed in the end.
Yeah, I found that part to resonate very much. I mean, with my own life, with my own writing, I guess you could say. With I'm a high school teacher, so with students and with players I coach, I feel like that's that idea of like if I don't put my full effort out there, then I can't be critiqued fully, right? Like, oh, I didn't try my best, that kind of thing. I think that's
Exactly.
really interesting. Yeah. Thinning Blood is the memoir. I wonder about some of the seeds for the memoir for the book.
The seats?
The seeds. I don't say that very clearly. Seeds, as in like growing.
Yeah. Um,
Just kind of
yeah,
like some ideas of kind of some of the inspiration. I mean, is it something that's been you've been working on for years? Was it a COVID project? I wonder about some of the seeds for it.
sure. It started, the very beginning of it started in nonfiction workshops at
Hmm.
my MFA. And sort of realizing that there was a lot I could help people understand that I thought was commonplace.
Hmm.
It was between that and the other sort of root or anchor for it all was the desire to have a tangible memory of my family, have a written record of my family and my tribe,
Hmm.
because it is at this point, in danger. Like
Hmm.
there is a chance it won't be around for much longer. So having something makes it harder for people to forget,
Yeah,
was also a big driving force behind the creation of it.
I appreciate that. I wonder about some of the terminology. Tribe has kind of gone in and out of like political correctness. I don't know what the term would be. I wonder about your rationale in using tribe and Native American and kind of what you've learned like in your own life and also like in the academia of it. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
In academia the terms will change. I wonder about kind of how you see and maybe an evolution of the term tribe or Native American that you've seen even in your life.
I think the term tribe, I think it has become sort of a little less commonplace in everyday speech. I know I
Okay.
used to hear it a lot as far as like people say like I found my tribe, meaning
Mm-hmm.
more like found family or
Sure.
group. But as far as like the connection to tribe as in like my actual tribe, like
Mm.
my native, my heritage, I think that has always been the same, or at
Okay.
least as far as I've been aware.
Okay.
There have been other terms. There's different levels of things, but
Mm.
tribe has always, as far as I know, has always been there.
Mm.
Um, Native American is, I think, one of the more common terms. It's probably less used now than I think indigenous. I think
Sure.
indigenous is the one that sort of evolved, even in the past couple of years, has become even the more prominent
Mm.
term. Uh, Native American, I think, is one that I think people, uh, regardless of cultural background or understanding, would have reference for, whereas
Mm.
indigenous is more, I think, within communities and
Okay.
slowly spreading. So that was why I tended towards one that would be a little bit more universal, or at least I think it would be.
Mm. I appreciate that. the intro for the book starts with, you writing about, not quote unquote, not knowing how, quote unquote, to be a Native American, and the fact that, as you just said a little bit, you're the last in your family line with the Jamestown S'Klallam blood.
Mhm.
Um, and you talk about differing levels of cultural pride, things like spirit animals, which has been, co-opted and, by non-Native American communities, or appropriate, I guess is a better term, right? And you write
Yeah.
about, like the totem pole, which again is, a term a lot of people use without knowing its background.
Yeah.
And the idea of propping up your own base, your own totem pole with your memories and stories. So I just wonder about like I guess the symbol of the totem pole, which goes from beginning to end of the book, and why you decide to really focus on that.
The totem poles and are such a prevalent symbol throughout like the Pacific Northwest and
Mm-hmm.
especially the town where my tribe is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it really is a marker that I think represents the fact that my tribe is still there, that Native Americans, Indigenous people were still here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's part of why, it's this idea of something standing the test of time and serving as representation and reminder of the community that it comes from. And so that was part of it, was this idea of trying to, because that's again, this book is meant to stand the test of time
Mm-hmm.
somewhat, this idea of being something that holds memory and record for as long as it is around.
Yeah.
And so I wanted between that and I do think that the symbolism and myth and totems of the women in my family were a big part of helping structure the book and helping understand sort of the evolution of like relationship with culture through the different generations.
Mm-hmm.
And so using them as the carvings on the totem pole for as the structure was also really key, I think.
Right. Yeah, so cool the way that you use the different women in your family, building, from high to low, low to high on the totem pole. And, just even, I mean, like you said earlier, just writing a book for your family and to keep these stories alive. This would be a cool book just to like share with your family, if it were just that, but it's also so universal. So, so it's incredibly specific to your family, to your tribe, but it's also very universal. So I was really impressed with that. The title, my understanding is basically that it comes from, the fact that if you were to have a kid, and that comes up a lot later, you being 1/8, your kid would be 1/16th, right? Most likely.
Yes.
This idea of the thinning blood. So I wonder about like the title and ideas of blood quantum, which backfire is not the right term, but it was, originally used by the US government to be abusive towards the Native Americans, right? And now it's
Yes.
often used by many Native American groups. So I just wonder about like the title, thinning blood, why you decided to use that, and the idea of the blood quantum as well.
I think Thinning Blood was a title that I chose specifically because it does capture this sense of waning or of
Mm,
loss
mm,
through just time. It's something that over time has gone on, and um, especially in its tragedy, especially when I uh, don't agree with blood quantum at all. I think
mm,
because again, it was a federal government and then was implemented by tribes, and it's put an expiration date on the tribes that use it because
mm,
there's only so long that people will be able to stay within that.
mm,
Um, and so it's this idea of a fully preventable tragedy, a fully preventable extinction, for lack of a
mm,
better word,
right.
that people just don't want to address because they've had it the same way for so long.
Mm,
And so that's kind of the idea, the idea of thinning blood is watching this sort of cultural separation or cultural like seeping away
mm,
um because people feel like they don't have you know some people in the the generation below mine that are 1/16th feel like they don't have the uh the right to be as connected because they
mm,
aren't allowed be tribal citizens.
Sure.
And some are adamantly fighting that. Some
Yeah.
are incredibly connected. So it's not everybody, but I do see, it's hard to fight for something when you're not given all the privileges and access.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know if it's at the end of the intro or the beginning of the first part, but it's I'm quoting directly from the book here. Just this idea of like of the women in your family as being the touchstones. Quote, they had forgotten, we had forgotten. Now I must imagine and put it back together as best I can. I am Lillian's great granddaughter and I have her strength. I am Vivian's granddaughter and I have her determination. I am Christy's daughter and I have her compassion. I am Leah and I have my voice and a story to tell. Unquotes. So powerful, and it gets us right into the ideas of like the bear legends. One of the early chapters is called Real Live Indians.
Yes.
I wonder about the situation where you had the girl who basically called you out and said, you're not native, or like natives, this idea of natives not being only in the past and not being with us in 2023.
Yeah. Um, there's a few instances of that. I know that the one that Real Live Indians opens on is from when I was a child.
Mm-hmm.
And it was we were 9 and it was
Yeah.
she was telling me that I was lying about being native and that Indians aren't real anymore. Um, and that was the first real instance of that for me.
Mm-hmm.
It happened plenty of times after, as that essay stands to show.
Yeah.
Um, but it was a bizarre feeling, and it was one of those like I you don't know how to comprehend, and especially as a child, you don't really know how to deal with it.
Mm.
Um, I didn't probably deal with it the greatest, as stated in the book. I definitely punched her in the face.
Eh.
Uh, but I didn't have the words, I didn't have
Right.
a way to like solve it diplomatically.
Right. You write about, the huge numbers, 95% of Native Americans, killed off with disease, with war, all those things. I mean, there's a lot of great scholarship and continues to be about, all the reasons why, just, a genocide. And I skipped through something that's really important there, but the bear legends, you start off with the bear as like the first on the totem, on the totem pole. I wonder what it is about, like, the mother bear, which people are kind of used to, but it's used in different ways. I wonder why you decided to start off with the first totem pole piece, first totem being the bear.
I wanted to do I wanted to, as far as like the structure of the book goes, I wanted to follow up um the totem pole. And as I state in my introduction, the person on the figure on the bottom of a totem pole is actually given the most reverence. They're the ones that hold
Mm.
everybody up and sort of start the story.
Hmm.
Um, and so bear was the natural place to start at the bottom of the totem pole because that is my great grandmother, and that is where this divergence, this thinning of blood, started.
Mm-hmm.
She was the last full-blooded tribal member in
Right.
the family, and so that that started off on this path, this you know for lack of a better word, dilution, this thinning of blood,
Mm-hmm.
um, and so that was why that was the place where I started, and choosing and using myth and retellings of myth
Hmm.
as for each section was very important to me because my family stories always get told as if they are myths, the same parts repeated, the same beats hit every
Mm-hmm.
time, and it felt very natural to me to include tribal lore and history alongside that,
Mm.
um, and show in a shaping of these like oral histories and these legends, a slight retelling and a version of them,
Mm.
um, shape these women and the stories around them to show how interconnected they are with their totem.
Yes, obviously there's subjectivity in the book because it's your memoir, it's your personal story.
Yeah.
But it's, one of the things that makes the book so good is that there are mixed feelings. Nothing is, 100% one way. Like you write about, correct me if I'm wrong, but mixed feelings towards Lillian, towards great grandma. You completely understand why, she searched for a sort of safety for her kids. The idea, at the time and continuing today is, like the Carlisle School and Pratt, who started it, was like, kill the Indian, save the man. And you write about, the forced adoptions and all these things where, assimilation was almost impossible to avoid. And you write about things like, how bears eat their young at times, which does maybe is not as bad as it sounds. And Lillian, and kind of the way that she abused her grandchildren. Now I think I'm maybe mixing up a little bit, right? She was the one who was not appreciative of her grandkids being that they were not full blooded. Am I right on that?
It was Lillian's mother. So it
Okay.
was, yeah, Lillian never had a problem with her children being, of different descent, but it was her mother
Yes, I'm sorry.
who, yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
Who Nora Cook, who
Mm-hmm.
disowned them, or not disowned, but had a lot of problems with them and treated them very poorly because they were not fully native.
Yeah, and again, straight from the book, it's a questioning of these women from a few generations back. Quote, how can you not see that they're still part of you, still strong? How could you give up on them? Don't you know your actions end your line? If you destroy them, what will be left of you? This is you, Leah, I can guess at the answers. Love is less important than preservation. I did guide them the best I could for as long as I could. They weren't strong enough to weather what was coming. I only gave up on part of them. My line in the future is less important than the world before me now. You know, I feel like so many cultures could relate to this idea of um, a safety, a fitting in, a preservation, but it doesn't mean that that you don't have mixed feelings. So I wonder
Yeah.
about writing about mixed feelings, especially when it's a family member.
Oh yeah, I think that that was something that I knew was going to have to happen because there is this sort of like the mourning of a culture I didn't get to grow up in.
Mm-hmm.
I was because of, Lillian's actions and her decisions, which I do understand. Again, I write about that. I do know why they were made.
Mm-hmm.
But because of those, I grew up without without any knowledge of anything. I had to go and piece it all back together on my own because nobody in the two generations that before me that were alive knew anything. Like they didn't know the stories or the songs or any of it. And so I had to go and find it myself.
Mm-hmm.
Um and now those people that learned as I was growing up, but they didn't start, I wasn't brought up with it.
Yeah.
And so, it is a a dual sense of like understanding the decision and still mourning the loss that it created anyway.
Yeah. The second going up the totem pole, the second part is about the salmon. You present the myth and the sacrifice of the family for the greater community. That the myth, like I said, the salmon, this idea of maybe the family has to be sacrificed for the greater good, for the overall. The idea of the traveling light for you, you know, your saga with the house in Port Angeles, with moving around a bit, very much similar to the salmon. And you reference like one of the ants talking about white Indians, and you reference a trip to the emergency room, and just ideas maybe of imposter syndrome. I wonder about what some of those scenarios, what some of those interactions, like in the emergency room when you felt like maybe you're kind of being stared at, and just kind of like that, the imposter syndrome. I don't know if that's the right phrase to use.
Yeah. Um, yeah, no, it's an interesting thing to feel like you're not who you know you are. That is the
Mm,
thing, is I've always known deep within my very soul that I am
right.
native and it is a very important part of who I am for
Mm,
me. And it was, it's still interesting to be around people that didn't believe that of me or
mm,
thought themselves more or whatever, whatever it may
yeah.
have been. It was interesting to be among people that made me doubt that or doubt that
Mm-hmm.
I was good enough to call myself native or native enough to call myself native.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was an interesting experience. for sure. I hated going to the doctor there.
Uh-huh. Well, yeah, you again, the ideas of the mixed feelings, you make it clear that you feel in your soul native, you know that you are, but you also make it clear why, I guess like how the external, how the government's actions over the years, over the decades, over the centuries have made it kind of like, oh, there are people who can be, who are imposters, or, so and so is claiming to be Native American to get a scholarship,
Yeah.
and right, you talk about the government actions that in your particular group, the Jamestown, the idea of the government actions that declared them not a tribe, maybe in the 50s, right? That takes away hunting rights. Just this
Yeah.
idea that like it does matter to the government who's native, and therefore you could see how that external racism maybe becomes internalized. Like you're a part of this, you're not, that kind of thing. I
Yeah.
wonder, yeah, I was wondering about how the greater actions like of the government, work on a kind of a daily basis within tribes that you've seen.
Absolutely. I think, the biggest thing is again the blood quantum, and how that's because that's become a line that people draw,
Mm,
and decide enrollment on. Well, now, any resources that a tribe may have go to tribal citizens, that has become incentive kind of placed by the federal government to keep tribal blood quantum laws in place,
mm,
because the fewer citizens there are, the greater the pool of resources is for everybody,
mm,
um, which is uh tricky for people that don't think, that may not want to think about the future and like okay, but what comes after this generation is gone.
mm-hmm.
This idea of longevity isn't present when you're thinking about the things you may need now.
Sure.
um so that's one thing. Again, there's a lot of government influence in what people are allowed, and also how, like, even, back to healthcare. um IHS, it's Indian Health Services, is run through the federal government. It's a federal wide program. um but that, in the 70s to 80s, they were performing unlawful hysterectomies on women,
Sure.
and sterilizing Native women, and were subsidized to do so
Mm,
by the federal government. That is, I write about the research of that as well, in the book. But so there's been a lot of things that it's sort of this idea of giving something, or be seeming to give something,
mm,
uh, but it's underhanded or harmful in some way in return.
right.
And that happens a lot. That is just sort of the story of
Mm,
a lot of tribal and native relations with the federal government.
mm. Well, you write about settling in like in your ancestral home, really, in Port Angeles and the Olympia Peninsula, settling in, but not quite, not going into the tribal events, the language classes. Sounds like that your husband at the time was, real negative talk, and that got to you. And but you also talk about like the positive, where like with your grandma Vivian, kind of swimming upriver with the whole salmon motif symbol, and rediscovering roots. And then also for you moving to New Orleans as kind of a liminal space, but maybe more in a positive way, and kind of getting your feet under you a little bit there. I wonder about the idea of Grandma Vivian as the salmon, and kind of swimming upriver, if we were using the metaphor.
Yeah. Um, yes, I think I would describe her whole life as swimming upriver.
Hmm.
She was a fighter for sure.
Hmm.
Everything she did was in defiance of the expectations set on her.
Hmm.
She overcame quite a lot in her life, and still struggled, I think, with some, I don't we never talked about it. It wasn't something she wanted to talk about.